Disclaimer. Hello, Stonehenge. Who takes Harry Potter takes the universe. But bad news, everyone, because guess who? It's J.K. Rowling. Day 93. Hermione suited up in full battle gear for the first time since the battle over Dover. She donned her carbon nanotube reinforced clothes and put on her basilisk skin coat, ragged though it was. On impulse, she cut away the torn left sleeve and exposed her bare arm. "Hermione, what are you doing?" George asked. "Me? I'm making a statement." She strapped her wand holster to her arm, and then her folded buckler over it on the other side, but she adjusted the straps so that they framed the scar cut into her arm that read "Mudblood" on a bare patch of skin. You don't need to flaunt it like that," he said. "I think I do, George." She strapped on her other holsters, including a new holdout wand on her thigh and a new stiletto on her ankle. With those, plus a few new tricks in her handbag and snickersnack girded around her waist, she was ready. "What do you think?" she asked. "This is the image I'm trying to project. Don't you think I look more intimidating this way?" George looked her up and down, and his face started to turn red. "You know what? You're right. That is a good look for you. You'll strike fear into the hearts of the Death Eaters and look damn sexy doing it." Hermione turned far redder. George had given her a lot of compliments over the years, but sexy hadn't been one of them up till now. Before she could say anything, he kissed her. It took some doing to assemble the team. No one had been to Wellow, so they couldn't apparate there, and a port key could potentially be tracked. The village was about 5 miles south of Bath, where they could apparate, so they met at a secluded location there. Harry, Ginny, Hermione, George, Fred, Ron, Sirius, Kingsley, and, after much consideration, Remus. Sirius was the only other person who already knew about the Horcruxes, and Kingsley and Remus were the only Order members still living who had anything close to real curse-breaking experience. Ron, to Hermione's surprise, hadn't blown up at her when they told him about Harry's and Ginny's connection. He had started to yell at Harry, not out of malice, just because his mouth tended to run ahead of his brain, but Ginny cut him off pretty quickly, so they managed to avoid serious drama there. They arrived early, before sunrise. There was just enough light to see as the 9 assembled there. "Harry!" a quiet voice called. "Sirius!" Harry hugged his godfather as he joined the group, and he was just as excited to see Remus when he arrived. "Remus, how's the baby?" he asked. "And seriously, is it a boy or girl?" Ginny jumped in. "You gits never told us." Remus broke into a broad grin. "Sasha's a boy, and he's great, and extremely tiring. I hope we never have to put him in a nursery, or I won't recognize him when I come to get him." "What, Tonk's ability?" Ginny said. "Yes, he's a metamorphosis just like his mother. She's already trying to get him to match her hair color. In fact, that's why we named him Sasha instead of a family name. Dora insisted on a unisex name." "How come?" "Because apparently metamorphs can switch." Hermione's head snapped around to that conversation. "What?" she said, her eyes wide. "I know, it surprised me too," Remus said. "I would have thought that wouldn't work. The chromosomes are different." "I don't know about that," he said. "All I know is, it's magic. Apparently it's harder though, so they can't do it on a whim, thank Merlin. But that's one of the reasons Dora doesn't like her own name, so she insisted on unisex. But she says she tried being a boy one summer and didn't like it, so Sasha will probably stay a boy too." Hermione stared and just shook her head. She made a mental note to figure out that puzzle if she ever got the chance. "Listen, Harry," Remus went on. "We couldn't get a message through to you earlier with you hiding out. Would you be godfather?" Harry's eyes grew wide. He stared at Remus, then at Ginny for a moment. Hermione wasn't sure what thoughts were exchanged, if any, but it seemed to resolve him. I'd be honored, Remus." "Me? Really?" "Of course. Dora quite agrees. No one better." "Ha!" Sirius laughed and slapped Harry on the back. "Now we can start a club, pup. It'll be great." "How's Tonks, or Dora?" asked Ginny. "She's doing well," Remus answered. "Except she tore me a new one for coming on this mission. or coming on this mission without her. I'm not sure which. He stopped and leaned closer to her. Ginny, what happened to your head? Her head? Sirius said, and then he saw her scar too. What the hell? Hermione spoke up. Long story. Suffice it to say, you know who can't get into Harry's head anymore. But that scar, were you hit by... No, different spell. She cut him off. Sirius turned, well, seriously, and nodded sagely. The thing you're working on for Harry? He asked. Yes, it's sorted. What's this? Remus asked. Tell you later, Sirius glanced at Harry, who nodded. Yeah, tell you later, I'm not sure who knows. Kingsley was the only other person present who didn't know about the Horcrux and Harry's scar, but no one contradicted him. They needed to get moving, after all. They'd called in most of their favors and scrounged up enough brooms to make the flight. They didn't want to spend 2 hours walking to the site when time was of the essence. They mounted their brooms and took off, flying low to the ground and disillusioned, but fast. The Fellowship of the Horcrux, Hermione thought idly. If only anyone else there would understand the reference. It didn't take long to reach their destination by broom. Finding the stone circle, however, was more difficult. Hermione, where is it? Ron called. Give me a minute, she said. She knew where the intersection was on the map, but she only had a couple of country roads in the dawn light to navigate by. And the circle itself would surely be hidden from the outside. Not knowing the age of the circle, she had to guess at the amount of continental drift, which meant that there was a stretch of land about the size of a Quidditch pitch where it could be centered. Finding the current geometric coordinates, she flew slowly northwest until she found it. There! She pulled back and landed just outside the magical field that revealed the stone circle. The rest of the team landed just behind her. It's right in front of us, she said. Stay close, we don't know what traps will be there. They walked forward until everyone was inside the enchanted area and could see the circle. Unlike the more symmetrical circle at Hogwarts, this stone circle was much older and resembled a properly maintained Stonehenge, an outer fence-like ring of stones surrounding a second ring of smaller rune stones and a lopsided inner ring of 5 trilithons. They didn't venture any closer, not knowing what they would find. Well, here we are, Kingsley said. Can you find it? Sirius asked. If it's here, Hermione said. It was probably possible to block her spell, but luckily no one knew about it yet. She stepped in front of the group so their presence wouldn't interfere and waved her wand in a wide arc. Atma Prakata! The spell didn't have as wide a range as Hominum Revelio, but it could be used as an area effect spell. The grass seemed to shimmer as the spell washed over it. In the early morning light, it was possible to see the mass of field mice and insects lit up by the spell. She wasn't prepared for the sheer number of them. Small as they were, there were so many that they lit up the field like fireflies nearly to the outer ring, and they radiated a feeling of being one with the earth. Whoa, several people said behind her. She turned and saw Kingsley staring at her. You've been busy, Miss Granger, he said. That's some deep magic there, Sirius said. I didn't know you'd come this far. Ha! And that was only the first part of you-know-what, Sirius, she said. Kingsley, Remus? The 2 dark arts experts crept forward, checking for traps. They found nothing as they approached, and halfway to the outer ring, Hermione cast the spell again. The lights appeared going into the ring, but no Horcrux. That wasn't surprising, since it only covered a small part of the ring. When they reached the outer ring itself, they stopped. That's the first trap, Remus said. If we cross the outer ring, it'll be a bad day. Right, she said. Keep working on it while I check the circumference. Atma Prakata! The spell penetrated about halfway to the center of the circle. Seeing nothing, she moved about 30 degrees counterclockwise and tried again. They'd come up opposite the heelstone at the back of the circle. When she tried in the next sector, she again saw nothing but natural life and kept moving. The Weasleys stayed close to protect her. Harry was trailing a bit, but presumably communicating with Ginny, if the vacant look on his face was any indication. It wasn't until she came to the entrance side of the circle that she saw it. When she cast Atma Prakata, it showed up at the edge of her range, the black mass of evil magic that marked a Horcrux, the aura of revulsion that recalled seeing a snake cut in half and writhing on the ground. It wasn't at the large altar-like stone in the middle. It was hidden in the blank space where a sixth trilithon would go if there were one, buried in plain sight. "There!" she said. Kingsley and Remus hurried around to her side of the circle and recoiled in horror when they saw the aura of the Horcrux. "That's some dark magic there," Kingsley said, shaking his head. "Definitely a Horcrux," Remus said. "I don't even need to have seen one before to tell you that." "Now we just need to pull it out of the ground somehow," Hermione said. "Plus whatever other traps are around it," Remus added. "I'm sure there'll be one on the second ring, and who knows what around the Horcrux itself. We can't take anything for granted with Rookwood." They worked on the wards for a while, disabling or suspending the worst of the traps, scanning and probing for others. Some were secondary traps set to go off 10 feet behind the main trap, but they caught them. They conferred with each other for a long time before coming up with a strategy to go forward. "Okay," Remus said. "We think we have enough to do it, but once we cross the outer circle we'll have to move fast. It has a cat flap curse on it. If anyone crosses the circle, it'll try to collapse on them. After that we can disrupt the curses, but Rookwood designed it to account for that. He puts fail-safes on the fail-safes on the fail-safes, and we'll have to actively counter them to keep some of the curses from activating." "What about the second circle?" Hermione said. "As far as we can tell, more of the same curses, but the second circle is enchanted to morph into rock golems," Kingsley said. The second circle was made of smaller runestones as tall as a man. "You'll have to fight them." "It should only be the two closest to you, though," Remus said. "He can't move too many at once without disrupting the circle." "And the Horcrux?" she said. "Just dig," Kingsley said. "If you don't get within the range of its direct protections, you should get a clear line of sight without tripping them." "Is that all? Rookwood could have done more." "He did a lot already," he replied, "and he probably wasn't expecting this many people." "What about from the air?" Harry suggested. "Would it be easier to go over?" Kingsley looked up at the row of stones that ringed the top of the inner circle. "No," he said. "Trust me." Ron cleared his throat. "You'll need at least 2 more to go in and fight the rock golems," he said. "I'll go," George said. Harry and Ginny looked at each other, and Harry said, "I should go." "And we'll have to be between the circles," Remus said. "We'll have to run all between separate stones. There won't be room otherwise. Best go in together so there aren't any surprises." "You'll have to stay close together," Ron said. "You don't want to activate extra golems." "We've got your back, Hermione," George said. "Are you two ready?" Remus and Kingsley nodded. They took their places in front of 5 of the gaps and got ready to run. "On 3, Kingsley said. 1, 2, 3. Hermione bolted forward, passing through the gap in the stone fence. She jumped as loud thuds sounded behind her as the center part of the stones above collapsed into the gaps. Once they were through, Harry and George rushed to her side. "Go!" Remus shouted. He and Kingsley were frantically slashing at the air with their wands, trying to hold the curses at bay. Hermione could feel the dark magic thrumming around her like an electric current, so close to touching her and the others. She, George, and Harry came together and rushed to the gap between 2 of the stones in the second circle. The standing stones shifted. They didn't self-transfigure. Instead, they changed shape with a grinding sound into crude troll-like soldiers in a fraction of a second. They took combat stances, and Harry and George immediately opened up with blasting curses. Hermione froze behind them. The flying fists of rock made the gap impassable. She waited for it to widen. The boys tried to force them back, but they put up a tough fight. She waited still, bouncing on the balls of her feet, until she saw an opening that looked large enough. She bolted again. A club of rock came down, and she ducked and rolled. It barely missed her head. When she stood up, she was through. She was in the interior of the circle. But she wasn't in the clear yet. The rock golems turned towards her. Not wanting to risk advancing, she snapped off a quick "Atma Prakata" to ascertain the location of the Horcrux. Only then did she edge around it, keeping what she hoped was a safe distance, and aimed her wand at the ground. "Hermione!" Harry yelled. She turned and her eyes widened. An enormous snake was slithering towards her across the grass at what seemed an impossible speed. It looked like a python until it opened its mouth and displayed huge fangs. "Nagini's here!" Ginny gasped as she saw the scene through Harry's eyes. Her own eyes grew to the size of saucers in shock. "What?" Ron started to say. "Nagini's in here!" she yelled. You know who knows. She hated that with the bindings they'd placed on their tongues, even their mental dialogue censored the dark wizard's name by now. "And he's coming!" she added. "We've got to get out of here!" Sirius yelled at once. "But Hermione's still working," Ginny said. "Fred, help them!" Ron yelled, but Fred was already running to help George and the others. Ginny prayed he'd get there in time. She saw through Harry's eyes as Hermione was distracted by Nagini, and the three of them inside the circle tried to fend off three foes. Fred ran through the nearest opening of the circle, which collapsed with a thud behind him and came up in the fight, wand blazing. "Stay there," Harry told her. The message was more feeling than thought, maybe not even intentional. A split-second decision of the mind jumping through several thoughts all at once. Crisp and clear, but too fast to put into words. She knew that he wanted her to stay out of the circle and away from the fight. Not even a logical choice, since it would be more dangerous out here when You-Know-Who arrived, but it came from his instinctive drive to protect her. She might have let a flash of indignation slip through to him, but she had other reasons to stay out here. She was Harry's eyes and ears on the outside, just as he was hers on the inside. "We have to go," Sirius repeated. Ginny saw the scene as Harry and the twins bought Hermione time to keep digging. "They only need a minute." "We might not have a minute," he said. "And they have to get out, too. We'll be sitting ducks when he shows up." "Hang on, I've got an idea," Ron said. "Quick, pick up all the brooms. Ginny, how good's your summoning charm?" Summoning charm? Harry thought. "Watch yourself," she sent to Harry, more a feeling than a thought itself. He had enough on his mind with the battle. He had tunnel vision so much that she had no idea where Hermione was now, even if she was in his line of sight. She only registered flashes of the scene. Harry slashing his wand to throw curse after curse at Nagini, to little effect. A pit opening in the ground where Hermione said the Horcrux was. The blinding terror of facing an enemy that was faster and deadlier than himself. "Summoning charm," Ron repeated. "We might need to do it together." "Okay." "Harry!" Hermione screamed. Ginny tensed and focused, taking a split second to assess Harry. Had he been bitten? Struck? But the flash of vision she got was of Hermione tossing something to him. He hefted it up with both hands. It was Snickersnack, Hermione's sword, which had cut off the head of Fenrir Greyback. She caught a flash of understanding from Harry. Nagini was magic resistant, but the very physical sword might get through to her. "Get on the brooms," Ron said. "I think I see where you're going with this," Sirius said. "He's right, Ginny. We'll need speed." Harry stumbled as Nagini nearly bit him. Ginny tensed at the sight, her heart pounding in her chest. Harry was starting to shake as their fear fed off of each other, so she tried to push the connection down without closing it entirely. Mechanically, she mounted her broom and picked up two of the others under one arm, and she took off after Ron. Sirius went off in the other direction. She felt Harry regain his footing. There were disjointed sounds of more spellfire, then a loud hiss that was suddenly cut off with a snick. She nearly froze as she saw through Harry's eyes Nagini's body going limp as her head was separated from it, and a shriek emanated from the body. That was it? Harry turned and joined the twins in fighting the golems. She hoped they were still okay. Now they just had to wait for Hermione, and pray that Ron's plan worked. Hermione worked frantically to pull Hufflepuff's cup up from underground while Harry, George, and Fred fought off the enemies. Nagini was here, which was very bad, until she saw Harry cut the snake's head off with Snickersnack. The snake's body writhed on the ground, and a black mist rose up out of it with a shriek. She stopped cold. The Horcrux was destroyed? What happened? The battle was still raging. With Nagini dead, she knew they didn't have long before You-Know-Who came at them full force. But then she had the cup. Dug out from the ground, it emerged to the surface on a stone pedestal. While it was still behind heavy protections, her spell should cut straight through. She didn't hesitate. "Magrisha Cadavra!" Sure enough, the curse cut straight through the dark protections and struck true. The soul fragment was expelled with an identical shriek, And that was that. "He's here," Harry yelled. Boom! Hermione reacted on instinct. "Geodasia!" Her geodesic shield went up just before the rubble hit them, forming a dome of magical energy made of triangular panels that kept the stone from falling on them. The two rock golems were completely blown away. She couldn't see what happened to Remus and Kingsley, let alone the rest of the team. When the dust cleared, the four of them were huddled in something like a crater, surrounded by shards of rock, the rubble blocking their view. There was a loud crash as the stones of the outer circle began to collapse, 2 by 2, all the way around. A shimmering bubble partly surrounded the circle like a larger half-dome, its edges glowing red-orange as it evaporated away like burning paper. The ground shook, and waves of magical energy washed over them as the protections broke. You-Know-Who had blown away part of the outer circle. Wards that 2 skilled wizards could barely contain blasted apart in seconds to get to them as fast as possible. "4 Death Eaters," Harry hissed urgently. "Ours are clear." He shot Hermione a pointed look, and she got the message. Don't hold back. She opened her handbag on her hip and pulled out a capsicum grenade, specifically hung close to the top of the bag in case of an attack. She pulled the pin before even handing it to Harry, and he threw it without hesitating. "Watch out!" Bang! Ah! She'd already handed Harry another grenade, a proper explosive one, and he threw it. With her wand, she pointed up at an angle and cast Pyrothalassion! The Greek fire curse launched over the barrier and would hopefully splatter fire over the enemy, one of the few spells she'd managed to get to follow a ballistic trajectory, and was any use casting blind. At the same time she cast it, a volley of rocks came flying over the barrier. She remembered You-Know-Who was still trying to kill Harry by indirect means. There was a dizzying series of explosions, flashes of light, and blurs of motion inside and outside the circle, but when it was over, they were still standing. George and Fred had shielded them. "Enough!" a sibilant voice shouted. You-Know-Who floated up into their line of sight, hovering high above the ground. He could have cursed them directly, but instead he gestured with his wand, and the rubble parted like the Red Sea, revealing the 4 Death Eaters Harry had mentioned. Bellatrix, Lucius, Rookwood, and a tall one she was pretty sure was McNair. "Harry Potter," You-Know-Who said, "you cannot escape. Surrender yourself to me and I will let your friends live." "Get ready to fly," Harry whispered. "Fly? How?" said George. "You're a liar, Tom." "What is he doing?" "Avada Kedavra! Expelliarmus! Crucio! Sectum Sempra! Protego! Protego! Dridristab! Carnifex! Viscera Expellite! Reducto!" What seemed like a dozen spells flew all at once. You-Know-Who had momentarily let his anger run away from him and cast a spell directly at Harry. Harry's spell connected with his, and a golden cord formed between their wands, but You-Know-Who shook off the connection immediately. He swirled his wand and the rocks began rattling. Hermione felt an intense heat wash over them. He was trying to melt the rocks, and she wouldn't put it past him to do it bloody fast. Yet the only way out was forward, and that was suicide. Harry charged. Hermione didn't have any idea what he was doing, but she followed his lead. She could hear burning grass and shifting rocks behind her. If she didn't want to be ankle-deep in lava, it was the only choice. George and Fred were right behind them, shield charms ahead like a battering ram, but she held her own shield in mind. "Semi Primera!" It wasn't particularly strong, but it had one particularly useful property. Unlike most shield charms, it would allow physical objects to pass through in one direction. She pulled another device out of her handbag and flipped a runic switch on it. If they were going down, she was taking one person in particular with her. She aimed the magical gun straight at Rookwood and pulled the trigger. Fully automatic, very high speed, recoil stabilized, silenced, at the price of completely burning out the runes with those settings. 30 rounds fired in 3 seconds. Rookwood's shield charm stopped the first 10. The next 10 tore into his chest, his throat, and then his head. And the last 10 rounds went over his head because she found herself flying up into the air and in a lot of pain. Hermione wasn't lifting herself. Rather, it was her clothes. She was wrenched upward by her coat and her trousers so hard that she was afraid her arms would tear out of their sockets and she might break her tailbone, not to mention the whiplash. The wind whipped around her. She hadn't just been levitated, she was being pulled, and pulled fast. The gun caught fire and she dropped it. Yunahu was screaming far behind her. She could barely hear it over her own screams. She was rattled to her bones as she swerved through the air at what felt like 100 miles an hour. Spells were flying past her, many of them deathly green. She was sure she was going to die until she saw a broom looming above her, and a large black hand clasped around her own. "Kingsley!" Hermione called. He pulled her up onto the broom, and she wrapped her arms tight around his waist and closed her eyes tight. "How?" "I'm not sure myself, Miss Granger," he shouted over the wind. "Potter!" Yunahu was airborne. The other Death Eaters may have been left behind, but he was dangerous enough on his own with his flight. A hot wind whipped around them. Hermione shook as she looked around. She saw Harry alone on a broom with Yunahu chasing him. Several other Order members spun around him, but they couldn't get close. "Miss Granger," Kingsley said, and he thrust another broom into her hands. She glanced at Harry one more time. "Oh, I hate flying," she muttered to herself. She flailed as she tried to hop off of Kingsley's broom and mount her own without spinning out of control and crashing. Against her instincts, she flew towards Harry and Yunahu and racked her brain. Did she have any other tricks up her sleeve? She could apparate Harry straight up like she had Mrs. Clark, but that meant she had to get close enough to grab him. Or did it? "Accio!" Hermione threw as much power as she could into the spell and let it pull her and Harry together while they were still racing forward at top speed. The brooms were not top production models, so Yunahu was able to keep pace, but it got her to Harry faster and cleaner than if she'd tried to swoop into his line of flight. Fire blossomed from Yunahu's wand, a roiling, unnaturally red thing that seemed to take shape of its own accord as some kind of great flying beast. Fiend fire! It flew at an impossible speed. It was nearly on them when Hermione reached out to Harry's hand and did what was probably the fastest and riskiest apparition she'd ever done. A moment later, her ears popped, and the air was blown from her lungs as they reappeared 2 miles above the fight. Harry gasped and screamed at the pressure change. "Ah, what the hell?" "Apparated straight up," she said. "It was the only thing I could think of. Hold on." She pointed her wand down and cast. "Arresto momentum." Their fall slowed and the whipping wind around them calmed, but only partly. Looking down, Hermione saw a glowing red flame surrounded by a tornado and growing in size. The fiend fire was racing up to catch them, and it was bloody fast, too. But not fast enough. Hermione pulled Harry into a hug, safer that way, and apparated them both directly back to the campsite. She collapsed on the ground and looked over her body, patting herself down to make sure she hadn't lost anything in the chaos. She was pretty sure she hadn't, which was a miracle in itself, but she did notice that she was sans shoes and socks, not to mention her broom, which was not a good sign. Everything else was still there, though. "Harry, are you okay? Oh!" she squeaked. "Ah!" Harry had collapsed on the ground, clutching his feet. They were bloody. "Oh God, Harry!" She crawled over to him in a panic and siphoned away the blood with her wand. All 10 of Harry's toenails were missing. "Harry, I'm so sorry!" she cried. "What about your fingernails?" His fingernails were fine, luckily. Are you okay?" she stammered. "Did you lose anything else besides your—" She trailed off. "What?" he said worriedly. She pointed to his head, and he finally noticed what she had the first time. Harry was completely bald. Even his eyebrows were gone. "Any other body parts?" she tried again before her voice fled from her. Harry tensed and started patting himself down the same as she had. He awkwardly turned around on his knees and she heard a zip. He sighed with relief. "No, that was all." "Pop, pop." Hermione spun and drew her wand, but Harry didn't. It was George and Ginny. He must have seen Ginny coming. She didn't say a word before she tackled Harry in a hug. George, however, stumbled at the sight of him. "Harry, what happened?" "Splinched," Hermione said, and she finally took a moment to draw a full breath. "Luckily it was just his hair and toenails. It could have been so much worse." She shivered. "He's lucky I didn't cut him in half with that stunt, but I didn't know what else to do." George just patted her shoulder. "You got him away safe, Hermione," he said. "That's the important thing." She nodded uncomfortably. "You too?" "We're okay. The others were fine last we saw. Oh, and I saved your sword." Hermione blushed and carefully took Snickersnack back when he held it out to her, replacing it in its scabbard. "Harry, mate, you gonna be okay?" George said. Harry winced. "Wish I could get to a healer for my feet," he groaned. "Reckon I'll be able to walk in a couple days, though, and my hair'll probably grow back by tomorrow."
"Oh, is there a spell for that?"
Hermione asked. "No, but I regrew it overnight before when I was 8, he said. "It always seems to stay the same length, you know. Sirius says it's a Potter thing."
"Well, that's good. Ginny, I'm so sorry." "It's okay," she said. "He's alive, and we got the Horcrux. We got both of the Horcruxes," she corrected, smiling. "That's all of them, isn't it?" "Yeah." Hermione started to smile too, and the weight of it hit her. "Yeah, that's all of them."
"You know who's mortal," Harry said. "He can die now. Properly die."
"Bloody hell, a killing curse would have put him down for good," George said. "Sure, but could any of us cast it?" Hermione said. "Besides, he was too fast to hit. He could summon a hurricane and lava from nowhere, and he nearly killed us twice with fiend fire. He would have picked us off before we could hit him." There was silence for a minute. "So, what's next?" Hermione said. "How can we take him down if he's so powerful?" "I have some ideas," Hermione said. "First, we need to get a hold of Kingsley again and check on the others. Then we'll need to talk to McGonagall."
"I think I've lost track of how many miracles we've had today," Kingsley told the group when they reassembled at their meeting place. "Everyone on the raid made it out alive, and without life-threatening injuries." It was true. Hermione and Harry had sagged with relief when they saw the others, and the Weasleys almost cheered. "So that's it," Harry said. "We got all the Horcruxes." "It would appear so if your information was accurate," Kingsley replied.
"I'm surprised cutting Nagini's head off worked," Hermione said. "My sword isn't magical, or at least it doesn't have any offensive magic."
Most of the group shrugged, but Sirius spoke up.
"We know to destroy a Horcrux it has to be damaged beyond repair, right? Unless you use your spell, Hermione. But a living Horcrux can still suffer injury and illness. At least Harry could. It's not indestructible like a regular Horcrux, so maybe killing it counts." "Except Harry wasn't a proper Horcrux," Hermione pointed out. "Although I suppose I can't argue with the results." "And you know who made a mistake like that?" said Ginny. She thought for a moment. I'm guessing that even he didn't know what would happen. For someone so afraid of death, he's been surprisingly cavalier about how he handled his soul pieces. You know, the diary."
Ginny shuddered briefly, but she nodded. Harry put his arm around her shoulders.
"Well, you're right about one thing, Kingsley," she said. "It was a bloody miracle we all got out of here."
"We used a lot of tricks they weren't expecting," Kingsley said. "I wouldn't expect your plan to work again, Ronald. Or yours, Miss Granger."
"What did you do exactly?"
Hermione turned to Ron.
"Kingsley said it," Ron said proudly. "You know who wasn't expecting that many people to be there. It makes sense he'd only be expecting a couple of us to go after the Horcrux, because we'd want to play it close to the vest." "Which we did until that mission," Hermione pointed out. "Right. So I had us pick up the brooms so he wouldn't think there were more of us, and we flew away from the circle. Then, when he smashed the wards, we flew in and picked up Remus and Kingsley, and then the rest of you. Course, I reckon it wouldn't have worked if Ginny hadn't known where Harry was and what was going on." "And Harry knew what she was doing and could warn us," Hermione added. "And because you knew he wasn't trying to curse Harry directly," Ginny said.
"I'm just glad I could do something," Harry muttered. "I feel like you're doing so much more than I am."
"That's because you're spending half of every fight fending off you-know-who," Hermione said. "There's not much we can do but retreat when he shows up. I still don't know how he's that powerful. It sounds awful to say, but even just you distracting him helps the rest of us a lot. And besides, this time, your connection with Ginny saved us all.
Yep, never doubted you, Harry, Fred said.
Uh-huh, I think it's safe to say teaming up with Ginny was a definite improvement, George agreed.
Ginny gave him a mock glare, and he moved on.
Okay, next order of business. Did you see what Hermione did to Rookwood?
Hermione blushed.
Oh, yeah, Harry said. You built a bloody machine gun? Not a very good one, she said. It burned out almost instantly.
A what? Kingsley asked.
A muggle gun that shoots very fast. Rookwood won't be coming back from that.
She thought on that a moment more, and smiled.
And that means I don't have to hold back anymore. You mean you've been holding back?
Ginny said in alarm. George looped an arm around her shoulders.
All in a day's work for the great arithmancer, eh? He said.
Hermione chuckled darkly. She definitely had more to work with, and once they talked to McGonagall, she would start putting it into motion.
Archimedes, she said. It's Lady Archimedes.
Minerva McGonagall had just got back to her office from her last class of the day, debating whether to lock the door and have herself a good cry. Things were getting bleaker every day at Hogwarts. She'd thought things couldn't get any worse when those bastard Carrows and Crouch started torturing 11-year-old children. At least Severus had abstained, although she no longer remotely trusted his loyalty, given that he had refused to do anything about it. But that was far from the lowest the Death Eaters could descend, as they grew more and more aggressive about trying to force the children to torture each other. For a time there had been an uneasy ceasefire between them and the Seventh Years and Filius, which staved it off, but eventually they lost all restraint. That was 5 weeks ago, when Neville Longbottom straight up vanished. Minerva hadn't taken him to be the type to run away, and there hadn't been any rumors of snatchers hunting for him outside the castle. Indeed, her other students seemed to think he was still around, but had hidden so deep in the castle that even the staff couldn't find him. A week later, Megan Jones and Michael Corner also disappeared. The Death Eaters grew more paranoid, but the disappearances only accelerated. Every day another student vanished, sometimes two, and the Carrows grew ever harsher on those who remained. Astoria Greengrass might well be dead by now. After Amicus Carrow had pushed the sickly girl too far in detention, she'd fainted, and Poppy hadn't been allowed to see to her. And yet, somehow, they couldn't find a body, so Minerva hoped she was still alive with her other students. She had a strong suspicion that Dumbledore's army was behind this somehow. The seventh-year rolls nearly emptied, and the sixth-year rolls and even some younger students weren't far behind. Georgina Vector, a fourth year, and a Slytherin at that, hadn't been seen for nearly 3 weeks. This past week, her Newt classes had been more Slytherins than the rest of the houses put together, and with those who remained being so outnumbered, she despaired of her ability to protect them. She'd heard rumors of another fight this morning in the south of England, whispers that Potter himself had been there, but she didn't put much stock in rumors anymore. There hadn't been any confirmed sightings of Potter in 3 months. Kingsley had relayed to her that he was alive, but he naturally wouldn't tell her anything else. Here at Hogwarts, it seemed like there was no end in sight. Minerva poured herself a large mug of soothing tea. No brandy. She couldn't risk turning to drink in times like these. Then she sat at her desk and debated with herself for the 10th time whether it was worth it to bother grading her papers. At this rate, there wouldn't be much point in even giving the end-of-year exams. She was just settled in and trying to relax when she felt an unusual spell wash over her from the door. A presence detection spell. Minerva was on her feet at once, her wand out. "Who's there?" she demanded. "Show yourself." Nothing could have prepared her for the shock of Neville Longbottom hurriedly stepping into her office. Her eyes widened, and she flicked her wand to shut and lock the door behind him. "Mr. Longbottom!" she exclaimed. "What? How?" She stopped as her wits caught up with her. "What was the last thing Neville Longbottom said to me alone before he disappeared?" she asked. Longbottom's eyebrows shot up, and she belatedly remembered the boy's faulty memory. She feared he might not remember even if he was the real one. But he concentrated for a minute and answered, it was something close to, I don't know what I'm going to do, Professor, but I'm not going to sell my soul even to fake it. Also, Hermione says passwords are better. Minerva lowered her wand. She remembered Longbottom's bold words before his final detention, spoken like a true Gryffindor. Well, you are a sight for sore eyes, Mr. Longbottom, she said. Where on earth have you been? Where have all the students been? In the room of requirement, Professor, he answered. The room of requirement? But don't the Death Eaters know about that? Sure, but I figured out how to get the entrance to move months ago, so they can't find it again. And I figured out how to tell it to keep the Death Eaters out before that. Minerva goggled. Was this truly the same boy who stumbled off the stool forgetting to take the sorting hat off his head 7 years ago? Mr. Longbottom, never let anyone tell you you are unintelligent, she said. What are you doing here if you've been hiding out for so long? Longbottom held up a mirror. Because they asked to talk to you, ma'am. She saw the faces in the enchanted mirror and gasped. Miss Granger! Mr. Potter, is that you? She stammered. The boy's emerald green eyes and lightning bolt scar looked as familiar as the day she saw him as a too-thin first year, but his hair was cropped so short that it looked like what Muggleborn students called a buzz cut. She had never in her life seen a Potter with tidy hair. Yeah, it's me, Professor, Potter said. Got splinched, but I'll be all right. Goodness, and how are you? None of us have heard anything for months. We're doing well, Professor, Granger said. Very well, in fact. That was a surprise. I've heard rumors today, Minerva said. The fight this morning? That was us, Potter said. We all made it out alive. Harry lost his toenails, though, another voice said from out of view. Miss Weasley? She asked. Hi, Professor, the girl called. Listen, Professor, Granger said seriously. We've been in hiding because we've been finishing the job Dumbledore gave us. So you are working on Dumbledore's orders? Minerva said hopefully. Yes, ma'am. Potter took over again. The short version is, you know who set up fail-safes to keep himself from being killed. We finally destroyed the last 2 of them this morning. He can die properly now. Also, Hermione killed Rookwood, Ginny added. Minerva's eyes widened, and she saw Granger's face turn pink. She looked uncomfortable, so Minerva decided not to question her about it. What are you going to do now? She asked. Granger explained. The problem is, you know who is so powerful that I don't know if we can face him head on. Now, this is going to sound mental because you've been out of the loop for so long, but bear with me. I've been working on a ritual that I believe will be able to kill you-know-who at a distance where he can't get to us. Minerva stared. Granger was delving into ritual magic? That deep into ritual magic? If Granger was right, and Minerva would put down good money that she was, that sounded like one of the really scary rituals you only heard about in old stories. The trouble is, we'd have to be at the Anchor Stones of Hogwarts to cast it, Granger went on, and it will take time to set up. We want to coordinate with you and Professor Babbling about putting it together so we can get in and do it fast when it's ready, Potter added. Neville was just as speechless as Minerva was. Potter and Granger apparently had not told him this bit. They were delving into magics where Albus would hesitate to tread. I won't bother telling you how dangerous ritual magic is in general, she told them. But a ritual like this, how dangerous will it be to Hogwarts to cast it, Miss Granger, especially if it should fail? To the casters, extremely, she said, without hesitation. But to bystanders, not very, as long as they stay away from the lake. Stay away from the lake? She shook her head and didn't question it. And how confident are you that this ritual can succeed? Granger shrugged her shoulders. Confident enough that I'm suggesting this first over a direct assault, or stealing a Muggle attack helicopter. Minerva was still digesting that last statement when there was a pounding on the door.
Minerva, you will open this door at once, Severus called loudly. Longbottom and the pair in the mirror started. Minerva turned to him and thought fast. She flicked her wand and incanted, Non illude. She motioned for the disillusioned boy to hide in the corner and opened the door. Severus, she said. Severus stomped into the room and sealed the door behind him. Anger was radiating from him, and she pointed her wand at his heart, fearing that he'd finally shown his true colors. But to her surprise, he lowered his own wand, though he looked no less furious. Minerva, we have a problem, he said. The Dark Lord is coming. What? Here. Here? She gasped. But why? Potter, he snarled. I don't know what you heard, but there was a battle this morning in Somerset. Potter killed the Dark Lord's pet snake. His snake? But was that? She started, but she stopped herself before she could reveal anything incriminating. If you are referring to the tasks Dumbledore set for Potter, yes, the snake was one of them. You know? Naturally. Dumbledore entrusted me with the knowledge as a backup plan in case Potter failed, though by that point we would be in dire straits indeed. Albus trusted you that much? Minerva thought. She always trusted Albus's judgment in life, but telling Severus of the full plan smacked of foolhardiness, and she didn't think she would ever understand whence that trust came. But why is he coming here? She asked, dreading the answer. I was only told that he was coming to inspect the castle, but reading between the lines, I suspect that he wishes to retrieve one of the items from here. Minerva paled. And if he should find that the item is no longer here? He raised an eyebrow at her with that deadly stare of his that made students from all 7 years cower in fear. Is it? She took a deep breath. It's gone, she said. I've heard from a reliable source. They're all gone. Severus tried to school his expression, but she could see emotions playing over his face. Shock, fear, triumph? When he calmed down, he spoke deliberately. Then that would be very bad. I fear should the Dark Lord discover this, he would slaughter a large portion of the residents of the castle in a blind rage. I have heard whispers this day that he was amassing his forces, though that seemed inconsistent with what I was told directly until now. You should tell your... His gaze scanned the room. Reliable source. How long do we have, Severus? He told me 7 o'clock, so it will most likely be 6. She felt her hands start to shake. I'll tell them, she whispered. You should prepare. Severus left the room, and she collapsed into her chair. Professor! Longbottom stumbled forward, the disillusionment charm breaking, and he held the mirror out to her. Minerva steadied her trembling hands and put on a brave face for her students. Okay, new plan, Potter said gravely. We have to stop him from getting into Hogwarts. And how do you propose we do that, Mr. Potter? She asked. We have 45 minutes unless we are most lucky. He turned to his friends. Hermione, would you be able to set up that ritual now? Granger closed her eyes and took a deep breath. I'll need to think a minute, she said. She looked back in the mirror and said, Professor Neville, I think it's time I showed you my secret weapon. She stood and left the view for a few moments and came back wearing a distinctive tiara on her head. And Minerva almost didn't notice that at first because of the sudden change that had come over the girl. Her eyes were wide and her pupils dilated. The expression on her face was so much more intense, so much more dangerous, that she looked almost like a different person. Her whole demeanor was tense, and she was twitching minutely. It was then that Minerva remembered where she had seen that diamond tiara before. Miss Granger, she said, is that the lost diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw? She said. Yes, she answered. It was one of his safeguards. Mine now. The legends are true, then? The diadem was said to increase the wearer's intelligence. If that was Granger's secret weapon, then it was an unimaginably powerful weapon in her hands. In a sense, she answered curtly. It makes me think faster, gives me photographic memory. but it has its downsides. The ritual?" She closed her eyes in thought. "We'd have to get to the castle and start setting it up before he gets there," she said. "We'll have to hold him off, and we won't have much time. If it's not ready by sunrise, it'll do more harm than good. But yes, it's possible."
"Then that's what we'll do," Potter said. "We have to stop you-know-who from getting into Hogwarts. This is the only way. We'll have to rally the troops. Neville, how big is the DA now?"
"Pretty big," he said. "Twice the size it was when you were here." "That's got to be most of 50 and up outside of Slytherin," Hermione said.
"It is."
"And most of them have vanished from the halls," Minerva added. "We're all hiding in the Room of Requirement."
"Then it's time to come out," Potter ordered. "Storm the castle and take down the Death Eaters, teachers and students. Clear the way for us."
"The rest of the teachers are on your side, Potter," Minerva said, sitting straighter. "Tell us what you need."
"Just take control of the castle before we get there." He turned to Granger. "You can get us there in time, right?"
"I'll have to call Kingsley back for a port key. Yes, I can get us there."
"But how?" Longbottom said. "They're guarding Hogsmeade and the forest."
Granger smiled a smile that wouldn't have looked out of place on a goblin. "That's the other thing I learnt from my geomancy discussions with Professor Babbling," she said. "I know how to get through the unplottability ward. I know how to get to Hogwarts over land."